Welcome into the next lesson. We will move on to the next set of typical middle game positions and pawn structures. This time we'll talk about isolated pawns. We'll talk about a variety of eventual situations with isolated pawns, which cover many of the very common middle game positions. That's why this lesson will be especially useful. First of all, what is an isolated pawn? It's when you have a pawn and you don't have other pawns on the adjoining lines. In this position, for instance, black has the isolated pawn on f6. Here I have some really good news for you. In the previous lesson, we were analyzing positions with double pawns. And you will notice that the general ideas and middle game plans are very similar to the positions with isolated pawns and positions with double pawns. Let's compare. As you already know, when you play against double pawns, you need to attack those pawns, and you can also put your piece on a weak square around those pawns. Thus, in such a position, you can place one of your pieces on a strong square f5, and you can attack the opponent's double pawns f6 and f7. Now, you may notice that if we eliminate one of those double pawns, then we will have a position with an isolated pawn. Now, you may see that the position did not change dramatically, although we removed one of those double pawns. Now there is an isolated pawn on f6, which you can attack if you're playing white, and still you can use the weak squares around that weakness. This time there will be even more of those weak squares where you can place your pieces, which will help you penetrate into opponent's territory and start an attack. Here we just discussed the typical plans of playing against isolated pawns. Let's also think what you should be doing if you play with an isolated pawn. When we were talking about positions with double pawns, we were saying that thanks to those double pawns you do control some squares, and you can take advantage of this fact by placing your piece on a square controlled by the pawn. This is especially great for you if this is a central square, because then you can occupy the center and dominate the whole position. This is one advantage that you may have thanks to your isolated pawn. Another thing, we said that we call the pawn isolated when you don't have the pawns on adjoining lines. And thanks to this fact, you can activate your other pieces, for example your rooks, by placing them on those open files. Since the lines adjoining to your isolated pawn are free of your pawns, they can be used to activate your forces. Now let's make a general intermediate conclusion about these positions with isolated pawns and what are the plans of both sides. In the first lessons of this course, we discussed that in the middle game generally you have only two possible objects for your attack. This is either king or pawns. Therefore, if you play against an isolated pawn, you have a very convenient target for your attack, that weak pawn. And that will be your middle game plan to attack it and to capture it. If you play with the isolated pawn, then you don't have much choice but only to attack opponent's king, and that will be your plan. Additionally, both sides has some pros and cons of their position. The side which has the isolated pawn do control some extra squares and possibly some lines which you can use for your advantage. And if you're playing against isolated pawns, once again you can attack that pawn, and you can also place your pieces on the squares around that pawn, which are weaknesses of your opponent. Now let's have a look at the practical examples, and let's see how this general strategy works in real situations. Here we've got a very typical position with white having isolated pawn on a d4. Such a position can appear from Caro-Kann defense, Queen's Gambit, Nimzo defense, and from many different openings. How do you think? What will be the white's middle game plan here? You may like to pause the video and think about that for a moment. Actually, you already know a lot of typical patterns and you just need to apply them here. Well, first of all, we know that when you have the isolated pawn in the middle game, most likely you will be attacking opponent's king. So this will be your long-term plan. However, we also need to remember the evergreen middle game strategy, which is a center-forward play. Before you can start a successful attack of opponent's king, you need to make sure that your army, your pieces are stronger than the opponent's army. And that's why the first goal for white in this position will be to put all of his pieces on the most powerful centralized positions. Your isolated pawn is doing a good job in giving you some space around and behind that pawn. And you can use this space to develop your pieces comfortably and to control the situation. That's exactly what white started to do with his following moves. Firstly, he played rook e1, putting his rook in a central file. Then after bishop f6, where black tried to attack that isolated pawn, white played bishop e4, putting the bishop on the central square and also strengthening the protection of the isolated pawn. Black played knight to e7, and now white took advantage of his isolated pawn to centralize the knight, which is a great thing. Black replied with g6, which covered his king to some degree, but at the same time weakened the h6 square, which helped white to develop his dark squared bishop. And then white protected the bishop with the queen, simultaneously preparing development of the other rook, which he placed in the center on the next move. Now white has developed all his pieces and has placed all of them into the central ideal positions. The next part of white's plan will be to start searching for the ways to go into opponent's territory and attack something there. Most likely attack opponent's king. So let's see how he done that. In this position, black took the bishop. White recaptured with the rook. And black played knight f5. Actually, if black would do something else, for example, if black would just develop his bishop by playing bishop d7, white can really shift the attack to opponent's king directly by playing rook h4, which probably was the point of taking on e4 with the rook, and then white is ready to trade off the bishops, invade with the queen to h6, and just checkmate the opponent's king. In order to prevent this scenario, black played knight f5, so let's come back to the actual game. In the actual game, in order to cover his king, black played knight to f5, and then after the exchange of bishops, there is another very typical move that white played here. You can think about that for a second. How would you play here as white? The move is d5, and let's just think about the point of this move. You know that in the middle game you need to go into opponent's half of the board and attack something there, but first of all, you just need to go into opponent's half of the board, into his territory. And that's what you can do by pushing your isolated pawn forward. So it helps you to break through and start the direct attack of opponent's position. That's why for black, it's really important to keep control of that d5 square, and ideally speaking, to put his piece, for instance his knight there, to blockade white's pawn, and not allow white to take advantage of this advancement and developing his attack in the center. In this game, however, black failed to do so, so he managed to break through. Now he has the ideal centralization, and then he started the attack on opponent's king, played queen c3, taking aim at the king, and then after black took the knight, white made the intermediate check. So now the king is under check, black has to do something about that. White took back the bishop, and now black is defenseless. White has too many threats. The rook is hanging, knight f6 is coming, attacking the king. Also, once knight jumps somewhere, white's rook will attack the queen, and therefore black is defenseless, and white won the game within a few moves. In this game, white realized the proper middle game plan. First of all, he centralized all his pieces, and then he shifted the attack towards opponent's king. That's how you should be playing when you have isolated pawn in the middle game. This is the game between Ivanchuk and Elvest, playing black. Here we will be talking about black's plan, while playing against an isolated pawn. By the way, you can see that this time white has not the isolated pawn like we discussed before, but the pair of pawns in the center. Although the situation is slightly different, in reality it doesn't change it that much. In fact, the plans of both sides remain to be the same. For white, it is to centralize his pieces and then to look for the ways to go into opponent's territory and start the attack. For black, the situation is also relatively the same. This time black cannot really attack that pawn on the d4 because it is now supported by white's pawn on c3. So therefore black will be attacking that base pawn on c3, which is not protected by other pawns. Also, same with the positions with the isolated pawns, black has the nice square d5 for his pieces. In addition to that, with white's pawn on c3, black also has another square on the c4, which he can also use for his pieces. That's why, as you can see, in general, the plan of black is still the same, to attack weak pawns and to occupy weak squares around it. It was the same in positions with double pawns, with isolated pawn, and with two isolated pawns in the center. That's why, if you understand general strategy of the middle game and typical patterns, you will be able to play any positions easily and you will always know what to do. Okay, let's move on and have a look what happened in the game. Ivanchuk played a4, and at this point let me ask you the question, what do you think about this move? Whether it's good or bad, what do you think? Well, in fact, it's a deviation from white's plan where he should centralize his forces. He starts instead some play on the queen side, which is not his right plan, and therefore this is a mistake. So you can see that even very strong players sometimes misunderstand the right plan for both sides in these positions, in this type of positions. Okay, black continued with his development, developing a bishop to bson. White played knight h4. So he's trying to start some attack on the king side, but it is too early. As you already know, first of all, you need to centralize and make sure that you have strong pieces and that all of them are active. And in this case, white starts a premature attack without having his pieces ready. Black played bishop d5. We already know that black needs to take advantage of those squares that helps him to blockade white pawns and at the same time to put his pieces, black's pieces, on the very strong advanced squares. White played knight f3 and now bishop c4, continuing black's plan to blockade. Knight e5, black traded off the bishops. Generally, it is good for black to exchange pieces because the white's plan is to attack opponent's king. Therefore, when black trades off the pieces, he reduces white's chances for the attack. And at the same time, while trading off the pieces, black eliminates eventual defenders of white's weak pawns. Therefore, it will be easier for black to attack those pawns later on. And then black just starts to bring in more pieces to attack those weak pawns. Currently, he takes aim at the white's weak pawn on c3. White played rook f3, like jumped with the knight to d5. It still goes in alignment with the black's plan to put his piece in a strong square and also to take aim at that weak pawn on c3. White played queen b5. As you may notice, white is unclear about his plan. He makes some moves on the king side, and then all of a sudden he jumps with the queen to the queen side, so white is not really sure what to do. Here black played f5 just to close the lines on the king side and prevent any eventual attack of white there. And then after bishop e1, black made another exchange, which is still favorable for black, and then played queen to c4, and now black reached the ideal situation where he has the total blockade on the squares d5 and c4, while the white's pawn on c3 is still very weak, and black is simply going to attacking and capturing. So the game continued with bishop h4, black traded off the queens. Now the c3 pawn is hanging, white has to protect it. Black strengthened his blockade once again to make sure the pawn will not move forward, will not run away. After bishop e1, black played knight c7, and it seems like he's attacking the b5 pawn, which is true, but in addition to that, he prepared an interesting tactical trick, rook takes d4, taking advantage of the pin on white's pawn, and white resigned. He lost the pawn, and his other pawns will fall very soon. This time it's another game between two players that I never heard about before. The white player is Chandesris and black is Roser. Anyway, this time we still see the same pawn structure in the center. White has those pawn pair on d4 and c3, same with the previous example. However, white decided to change it into the pawn pair in the central squares d4 and c4, so he advanced his c-pawn. This is another very typical middle game pawn structure, and that's why I like to talk about that as well, so that you know how to deal with such positions. When white advanced his pawn to c4, the good thing for white is that he now controls all the squares in the center, and therefore black cannot put his piece on any of the central squares. Therefore white gained more space, and that's good for white. However, that happened at a cost of weakening his position. Now those d4 and c4 pawns are relatively weak, and black can attack any of those pawns. As you can see, advancement of the white central pawns and having those two central pawns on d4 and c4 has pros and cons. If the pawns are well supported by the white's pieces, then they will become a strength of the white's position, they will assure white's space advantage and better control of the situation. However, if the pawns do not have enough support from white's pieces, then they will become rather an object of an attack for black. In the current example, white's advancement c4 was too optimistic because white's rook and c1 bishop are still on their initial squares. Well, the kingside rook has cancelled, but it's still not in the game, and therefore white was not ready for such ambitious actions. Now let's see what happened next. Black continued his development, white played bishop e4 and traded off the bishops. By the way, what do you think? Is this exchange favor black or white? Well, we already know that in these type of positions, trading off the pieces is good for black because it eliminates the defenders of the central pawns and it reduces the white's chance for a kingside attack. And then black continued to centralize his pieces and to take aim at the white's weak pawns. He played rook after c8. I'm not sure why he didn't move the rook from the corner, which seemed to be more natural, but anyway, it didn't change too much in the position. Now black attacks the c4 pawn. White already has some problems with this. He protected it with the rook. Black continued to put more pressure with the move queen to a6, and white protected it with knight to d2. Okay, now you can see that black put all his pieces, almost all of them, to attack the white's weak pawns, and white took some steps to protect it. Now black needs to find a way to somehow break through. And here there is a very typical idea for black that you really need to remember because it works very well. When white has those pawns on the c4 and d4, as we said, the advantage of this construction is that those pawns control all the central squares and you cannot advance your minor pieces to those central squares. That's why you need to undermine those pawns and obtain some central squares for your pieces. You can do that by two ways. The one way is to push the b5 pawn, and another way is to push the e5 pawn. If black pushes the b5 pawn, by the way, black can't do that in this position because the white's pawn is pinned. That's why white cannot take. And then let's see what happens. If white replies with c5 and black retreats with bishop to e7, you see that now black has the excellent squares where he can place his pieces comfortably and they will be very active. For example, black can transfer the knight to d5, to the excellent central square, and that also helps black to blockade white's pawns entirely. Now this is one idea that black can use. Now let's go back. Another idea is that black can push the e5 pawn with similar motifs. Now if white either trades the pawn or pushes it to d5, you can see that black now has the new square c5 for his bishop or for his knight. And same with the previous line, now the white's pawns are totally blockaded and they can never go forward anymore. In the actual game, instead of pushing d5, white played rook c3, but it was also very much favorable for black. After an exchange of those pawns, black also continued bishop e5 to exchange even more pieces, and then black got a totally dominating position. Now the white c4 pawn is very weak, black has excellent positions for all of his pieces, and white is just doomed for a very passive defense and there is nothing he can do. And black's forward moves will be to just put more pressure on that c4 pawn and capture it at some point. And the current game black won after a few moves. So in this example, the most important position that you can remember is that position where black had the choice between two pawn moves which would undermine white's powerful pawns and create some new squares for black's pieces. Another useful conclusion that you can take from this game is that the central pawns can become either a strength of white's position or a weakness. It depends on how well they are supported by white's pieces. Conclusions. If you play with an isolated pawn in the middle game, there will be a few main things you need to do. First thing, centralize your pieces. This is evergreen rule which works in almost any middle game position. Secondly, put your piece on a central square controlled by your isolated pawn. Usually you need to put the knight there. And lastly, you need to attack. Look for the ways to go into opponent's half of the board and attack something there. Usually you will attack opponent's king. Sometimes you also can break through in the center by pushing your isolated pawn forward. When you play against an isolated pawn, there will be a few things you need to do here. First of all, you need to attack that weak pawn and try to capture it. Secondly, you need to place your pieces on strong squares around that isolated pawn. Well, these will be strong squares for you and weaknesses for your opponent. Finally, you need to trade off the pieces because it helps you to attack the pawns and reduce your opponent's counterattack, the power of this counterattack. As the most general conclusion, we may say that the isolated pawns, especially when they stand in the center, can be a power of the position when they are well supported by the pieces. Otherwise, they will become a weakness and a target for the opponent's attack. That's it for now. Now you know all the main plans for the positions with the isolated pawns, whether it is only one pawn or a pair of pawns, and I look forward to talk to you in the next lessons.